Hi everyone, my name is Yara Rivera. I am with the Rapid Response Team of the Global Education Cluster. I will be taking you through the second part of Module 1 on the fundamentals of coordination. In the onset of an emergency, the government and its national agencies have the responsibility to respond to an emergency. But if the capacity is limited, the government can request support to other actors. And under the United Nations system, an IAC cluster coordination mechanism can be activated. The country clusters, including the education cluster, are only activated based on needs when response and coordination gaps exist due to a sharp deterioration or significant change in the humanitarian situation, when the existing national response or coordination capacity is unable to meet the needs. The cluster activation is in essence a temporary mechanism. It's established when government capacity to coordinate is constrained, so the cluster's work is as much about capacity development as it is about the coordination of the response. At country level, the selection of the cluster lead agencies mirrors the global. In this case, it would be UNICEF and Save the Children. But sometimes that's not possible. And when it's not possible, the government and UNICEF will identify another local NGO to support co-leadership of the cluster. The cluster follows 6 core functions. The first is to support service delivery. In the case of the education cluster, it's to limit as much as possible the disruption to education services and ensure that the affected children have access to quality education and protective environments. Also, to adhere to the INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies minimum standard. The second function is to inform the HCT, the Humanitarian Country Team, strategic decision making. The third is to plan and implement cluster strategies. Strategies are important because the strategy gives pathways for operationalizing the humanitarian response plan. And you will learn more about strategy development and humanitarian response plan in Module 2 of this course. The fourth function is to monitor and evaluate performance. The fifth function is to build capacity, national capacity in preparedness and contingency planning. The sixth is to support robust advocacy. All the while, the cluster is accountable to the affected populations, making sure the affected populations are consulted from identifying the needs, the relevant response activities, as well as in the monitoring. Central to this idea of accountability to affected populations, it is the mandate of the education cluster to protect and assist children, family, and communities, as enshrined in international law and conventions. When we put people, in our case children, families, communities, teachers, at the center of the education response, they are more likely to be satisfied, and we're more likely to protect their rights, achieve meaningful results for them. And in working with communities and local partners, we are establishing a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. And in ways, we're also strengthening the local capacities and building resilience. In essence, it's all about respecting and enabling the affected population to exercise their rights. It's about generating results that meet the affected population needs and priorities. And it's about this relationship based on trust and respect that support local capacities and build resilience. Guided by the HCT, the Humanitarian Country Team, which is the decision-making body of the humanitarian response in the activated IASC cluster coordination approach. The Intercluster Coordination Platform, chaired by OCHA, the Office for Coordination in Humanitarian Affairs, and comprised of cluster coordinators from each active cluster, enables the clusters to work together to advance the delivery of assistance to affected people in an effective and efficient manner. At the cluster level, there's an establishment of the Strategic Advisory Group, SAG, also known as the SAG. It's made up of members of the cluster. It's a smaller group that enables to identify priorities and key messaging on behalf of the larger plenary group that can be taken up to the intercluster and HCT for decision making. SAG membership must be representative of the overall cluster partnership. Apart from UNICEF, and the NGO cluster lead agency, SAG members are to include government representatives or focal points, donors, and national NGO forum representatives. In order to be efficient and effective and avoid challenges arising from a large number of partners identifying priorities, SAG membership should also be limited. Membership processes can be decided by the collective plenary group. Members could be elected, they could serve on the SAG on a rotating or an ongoing basis. There can also be the establishment of technical working groups, which are task-oriented and time-limited. They are created as needed, for example, to contextualize the INE minimum standards, to formulate appropriate technical practices, to find solutions for local issues, and they will advise the SAG accordingly. While the education cluster is established at the national level in most cases, it is also beneficial to establish a subnational cluster. The benefits of establishing the subnational coordination mechanism is to strengthen accountability to the affected population, to work closely with local partners and authorities, in essence being closer to the response geographical location, to support real-time implementation, and adapt response and priorities to the local circumstances. The cluster will encompass the principles of partnerships and its way of working. This includes complementarity, ensuring that to elevate the resources amongst the partners and to take into consideration the comparative advantage that each partner brings, to ensure transparency in communication amongst the partners of the cluster, with the other clusters, and to the communities affected. The principle of responsibility to the affected populations to achieve results. The principle of being result-oriented. And the principle of equality to ensure the voices of all partners as well as the affected populations are heard. Encompassing all of these principles and putting them into practice will enhance the effectiveness of the humanitarian response. In mixed settings, there could be multiple coordination structures operating simultaneously in country with possible overlaps when it comes to geographic coverage. Coordination structures could be activated at different times with more or less established procedures and systems. This current slide gives some examples of current situations that are considered mixed or complex settings, where the traditional IAC cluster approach does not apply. Coordination will be different in this setting. While humanitarian coordination systems are accountable for delivering life-saving assistance to people in need in line with humanitarian principles, the cluster approach established in 2005, the cluster leaders are accountable to the humanitarian coordinator. The refugee coordination system has a further specialist mandate to ensure international protection of and respect for the rights of refugees. Ensuring that specific educational needs of refugees are met may in some contexts require politically sensitive negotiation and advocacy with national authorities and other stakeholders. UNHCR mandate include working with host governments to ensure international protection and ensuring access to service extends from the arrival of refugees until durable solutions are in place. Since the mandate and accountability for refugees and persons of concern is not transferable, the cluster approach does not apply in refugee situations. Refugee protection and assistance is linked to finding durable solutions, which goes beyond the coordination of an emergency and humanitarian assistance that is intended for a shorter scope and time frame within the cluster approach. In development contexts, the Ministry of Education leads sector coordination through an education sector group, often referred to as the Local Education Group, or LEG. The LEG coordinates development, aid, and policy dialogue for the sector and is at the center of all stages of the education planning cycle, from sector analysis to evaluation. If an emergency is declared and the cluster approach is activated, the country education cluster as said before, can mirror the global co-leadership where UNICEF and Save the Children are designated cluster lead agencies for the education sector, or UNICEF and the Ministry of Education can identify another NGO to support the co-leadership of the cluster. When there are mixed settings with refugees, it's important to note that UNHCR is responsible for coordinating interagency efforts in a refugee response, including overseeing sectoral working groups. It is undoubtedly evident that stronger education sector coordination is critical to reach more children with quality education services during crises. At the global level, the Global Education Cluster, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, and UNHCR have teamed up to review coordination mechanisms in mixed settings in order to collectively identify gaps and opportunities to improve education sector coordination during emergencies and protracted crises. This collaborative effort, known as the Global Partners Project, has produced evidence on the challenges and contribution of formal coordination approaches for education planning and response in emergencies and protracted crises. Some of the findings demonstrate that in mixed and complex settings, this connection between the education cluster and the refugee working group for education can cause inefficiencies. Humanitarian coordination and development systems for education are not systematically connected, and as a result, crisis-affected children and youth may be invisible in national sector planning and processes. In response to these key findings, the Global Partnership has fostered dialogue on needs, gaps, and opportunities for collaboration at global level and has laid the ground for joint operational support among the global partners. A more in-depth module on coordination in mixed settings will be available at a further date. This concludes Module 1 on the fundamentals of coordination. I wish you luck in your continued efforts to promote education in emergencies and strengthen coordination.